A barber on Mulberry Street kept two ledgers. One sat on the counter for anyone to see. Haircuts, 10 cents, shaves, 5. The other lived in a cigar box under the third floorboard from the door, and it recorded something closer to a small bank's daily business. By 1929, that second ledger tracked more money moving through a single barbershop chair than most laborers on the block earned in a year combined. This wasn't unusual. It was the trade. A 1923 survey conducted by an Italian mutual aid federation in Manhattan counted over 200 barbershops operating south of Houston Street. Officials who reviewed the survey assumed most were marginal businesses, a chair, a strop, a mirror, barely profitable. They were wrong about almost all of it. The chair was rarely the product. It was the excuse for everything else happening in the room. Hit subscribe. What follows are 10 practices that turned an ordinary trade into something closer to a financial institution. None of it written down in any textbook. Most of it never spoken about outside the shop itself. The dime that never changed. The first one starts with a question nobody could answer for years. How did a barber named Tommaso Greco, who charged the same dime for a haircut from 1910 to 1931, end up owning the building his shop was in by the time he stopped charging that dime at all? The answer was the chair itself, and what happened in it that had nothing to do with hair. Greco's shop on Elizabeth Street functioned 3 days a week as an informal escrow office. A longshoreman who'd just been paid might walk in not for a trim but to hand Greco an envelope. Rent money, often, that he didn't trust himself to still have by Friday if it stayed in his own pocket past a card game on Thursday night. Greco held it. No interest, no fee, no paper. He wrote a man's initials and an amount in pencil on the inside cover of a discarded ledger book a printer down the street had given him for nothing. When the man came to collect, Greco crossed it off. His granddaughter, in a 1986 interview recorded for a Lower East Side oral history archive, said her grandfather considered this part of owning a chair people trusted, and that the trust itself was the asset, not the money sitting in the drawer. Greco never touched a customer's held cash for his own use. He didn't need to. He made his real money differently, as the next 9 points will show. But none of that worked without this foundation of being the man on the block nobody suspected of skimming. By the time he bought the building in 1931, the down payment came from somewhere else entirely. The trust came first. The capital came later, and only because the trust had already been spent for over a decade, buying him a reputation no bank statement could replicate. A drawer beneath the register. Second on the list, and stranger than it sounds, barbershops doubled as the only place on many blocks where a man could place a small bet without being arrested, lectured, or cheated. And the barber's cut from running this quietly was often larger than his cut from cutting hair. Antonio Ricci ran a shop near Hester Street from 1915 onward, where a numbers game operated out of a drawer beneath the cash register. This wasn't charity work or a side hustle Ricci stumbled into. It was deliberate, and it was profitable in a way his haircut prices never could be. A bricklayer might place 10 cents on a 3-digit combination tied to a published number. Sometimes a stock exchange closing figure, sometimes a racetrack total. And if it hit, the payout ran 600 to 1. Ricci took a cut as the local agent for a larger operation run out of Brooklyn, the kind of arrangement law enforcement in the period mostly tolerated as a victimless nuisance unless a scandal forced their hand. This part of the story carries real weight, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. The numbers game preyed on the same economic desperation that made all 10 of these practices necessary in the first place. Men lost money they couldn't afford to lose. Ricci profited from that loss as surely as he profited from a haircut. A 1931 grand jury investigation into Brooklyn-run numbers operations estimated that Italian and black neighborhoods in several boroughs combined lost an amount equivalent to several $1 million annually to a system designed so the house could never lose over time. Ricci wasn't a victim of this system. He was, on a small scale, one of its operators, and he built real capital doing it, capital that eventually let him close the barbershop entirely in 1938 and become a landlord with 4 properties, none of which had anything to do with hair. Mail addressed to a chair. The third practice was less morally complicated and far more common. The shop functioned as the neighborhood's unofficial post office, telegraph desk, and message board, and the barber charged for all 3 without ever calling it a service. A letter from Sicily addressed simply to Giovanni Barbershop, Mulberry near Grand, would, more often than the postal service liked to admit, find its way to the correct Giovanni, because the barber on that corner knew every man who used his chair, where he worked, and often where he slept. Salvatore Pinto, who ran such a shop from 1908 to 1940, charged 2 cents to hold mail for men without fixed addresses, seasonal laborers who moved between job sites and couldn't list a permanent residence anywhere. He also let men use his shop's address to receive money orders from family back in Calabria, since a barbershop address looked more legitimate to a wary postal clerk than a rooming house known for housing a dozen men in 3 beds on a rotating basis. This sounds like a minor convenience. The volume tells a different story. Pinto's own account books, partially preserved by a grandson who donated them to a regional historical society in 2003, show he processed mail-holding arrangements for as many as 90 different men in a single year by the late 1920s, at 2 cents each, multiple times a month for the ones who came in most often. It wasn't a fortune on its own. Combined with everything else happening in that same chair, it added up to something closer to a small business inside a small business, charging fractions of a cent that nobody questioned, because the alternative, going without mail entirely, cost far more. Information as inventory. Fourth, and this one explains why so many barbers seem to know everyone's business before anyone told them. Information moved through the chair, and information was worth money in ways that had nothing to do with gossip. A man getting a shave talks. He talks about a foreman hiring extra hands for a construction job starting Monday. He talks about a landlord 2 blocks over who's quietly looking to sell before a building inspection turns up violations he can't afford to fix. He talks about a cousin back in Naples looking to emigrate and needing a sponsor's address for the paperwork. Giuseppe Mara, who ran a shop on Thompson Street starting in 1912, treated this information as inventory. He didn't sell tips outright. That would have emptied his chair of customers within a month, once word spread that he couldn't be trusted with a private conversation. Instead, he positioned himself as the connector. He'd mention, to the right man at the right moment, that someone else was hiring, looking to sell, or looking to buy, and let the 2 parties find each other. He took nothing formal for this. What he got was reciprocity, owed favors that compounded over 20 years into business relationships worth far more than any single tip would have been. By 1933, Mara held a minority stake in 3 separate small businesses, a grocery, a small trucking outfit, and a share in a building, none of which he'd put up significant capital to acquire. He'd put up information instead, delivered at the right moment to the right man, for 2 decades until the favors owed to him had compounded into ownership. The bank that never opened a branch. The 5th practice involves something almost nobody outside the trade understood at the time. Barbers extended credit more freely and collected on it more reliably than the banks 4 blocks away ever managed to. Rocco Sansone ran a chair on Mott Street where regular customers who'd lost work could keep getting haircuts and shaves on credit, sometimes for months, with the debt simply tracked in his head. No notebook, nothing his customers could point to and dispute. This sounds reckless. It wasn't. Sansone understood something the formal banking system, with its English-language paperwork and rigid hours, never bothered to learn. In a neighborhood this dense, reputation was collateral, and a man who didn't pay a barber back would find every door on the block harder to open afterward, from the grocer to the landlord to the priest who heard everything eventually. A union report from 1924 examining Italian neighborhood credit practices noted, almost as an aside, that informal trade credit, extended by barbers, grocers, and tailors, functioned with default rates far lower than formal consumer lending in the same neighborhoods, despite having no legal enforcement mechanism whatsoever. Sansone never sued anyone. He never needed to. He extended credit for 14 years before retiring in 1936, and his own estimate, given to a nephew decades later, put his total uncollected debt over that period at under $30. The chair worked as a credit system precisely because everyone involved understood what happened to a man standing if he treated it carelessly. The uncomfortable chapter. Sixth on this list is uncomfortable to discuss honestly, and it deserves that honesty rather than a softened version. Several barbershops in Little Italy functioned as informal collection points for protection arrangements, and the barber's role in this, sometimes willing, sometimes coerced himself, varied enormously from shop to shop and year to year. Documenting this requires care, because the line between a barber voluntarily profiting from organized crime's local presence and a barber simply trying to survive its presence wasn't always visible from outside the shop, and in many documented cases wasn't even clear to the men inside it. A 1936 federal investigation into extortion rackets in Lower Manhattan noted that certain businesses, barbershops prominent among them, given their role as informal community gathering points, were used as collection sites, sometimes with the proprietor's active cooperation in exchange for a cut, sometimes under the same threat the rackets used against everyone else on the block. The historical record doesn't allow for a clean conclusion about which barbers profited and which simply endured. What it does show is that some shops generated income through proximity to this system that had nothing to do with what any customer paid for a haircut, and pretending this part of the history away would falsify the picture as badly as exaggerating it would. The nickel reading. The seventh practice returns to cleaner ground. Barbers functioned as informal notaries and document readers for a population where literacy in English, and sometimes informal Italian, was inconsistent, and they charged accordingly. A contract, a lease, a citizenship document, a letter from an employer, these arrived in a language and a script that defeated many of the men who needed to understand them urgently. Filippo Cardona, who ran a shop near Baxter Street from 1919, had learned passable English in a settlement house night class and made himself the man customers brought their papers to. He charged a nickel to read a document aloud and explain it plainly. He charged a dime if he had to help draft a response. Over a single year in the mid-1920s, by his daughter's later recollection, this added up to roughly $4 to $6 a month. Not a fortune, but steady, low-effort income layered on top of the haircuts, requiring nothing but a skill almost none of his customers possessed and almost all of them needed regularly. Cardone never advertised this service. He didn't have to. Word moved through the neighborhood the way it always did, mouth to mouth, until the shop on Baxter Street was known less for its haircuts than for being the place where a man could understand what he was about to sign before he signed it. The Chalkboard Christmas Club. The eighth involves the chair as a savings mechanism disguised as a ritual, and it worked because it never felt like saving at all. Several shops ran informal Christmas clubs. A customer would pay an extra nickel or dime on top of his regular haircut price throughout the year, with the barber holding the surplus until December, when it came back as a lump sum meant for holiday expenses the man might otherwise have struggled to cover all at once. Pietro Donato operated one of these out of his shop on Spring Street starting in 1921. He kept the running totals on a chalkboard visible to everyone, partly for transparency, partly because customers liked watching the number climb week over week. By December, a man who'd been adding a dime a week for most of the year might collect $4 or $5 he'd never have set aside on his own, given how easily loose change disappeared into smaller daily expenses otherwise. Donato took no cut and charged no fee for running this. His payoff was different, a shop people returned to every single week, all year, because leaving meant forfeiting whatever they'd built up on that chalkboard. The savings club wasn't his profit center. It was his customer retention strategy dressed up as a kindness, and it worked for over a decade before changing economic conditions in the 1930s made the small weekly surplus harder for most families to spare at all. 6 men, 1 handshake, 9th, and this one explains the buildings. Several of the barbers who eventually owned real estate got there not through the shop's daily income at all, but through pooled investment clubs, organized among barbers themselves, men who trusted each other's trade enough to trust each other's money. A group of 6 barbers operating shops within a few blocks of each other on the Lower East Side formed what amounted to an informal investment partnership in 1922. According to a deed record later uncovered by a property historian researching the block's ownership chain, each man contributed a fixed amount monthly, accounts differ on whether it was $8 or $10, into a shared fund used to purchase distressed properties as they came available, often buildings whose owners had defaulted during economic downturns and needed quick, no-questions cash sales. The barbers, none of whom individually had the capital for a property purchase, pooled enough between them to act as a single buyer. By 1934, this same group of 6 men collectively held title to portions of 3 buildings, with rental income split according to original contribution shares. None of them had any formal training in real estate. What they had was 12 years of trusting each other's word on monthly contributions, in a system with no contract beyond a handshake and a shared understanding that a man who didn't pay his share that month wouldn't be welcome in anyone's chair the following week, including his own, since word would travel between shops as fast as it traveled within one. Why the chair never emptied. The 10th and last practice is the one that explains why so many of these barbers never seem to spend money the way their growing wealth might suggest they could afford to. Almost none of them ever stopped cutting hair, even decades after the real money had moved elsewhere into property, partnerships, and pooled investments that dwarfed what any razor could earn. Tommaso Greco, the same barber who's held cash for longshoremen opened this account, still stood behind his chair 6 days a week in 1948, by then owning the building outright along with 2 others nearby, his rental income alone worth many multiples of what the shop brought in. His son asked him once why he didn't simply retire and live off the rents. Greco's answer, recorded by his granddaughter decades later, was that the chair was where he heard everything worth knowing, where every deal and every piece of information that had built the rest of it still arrived first, and that a man who stopped sitting in that chair would stop being the man people brought things to. He wasn't cutting hair for the dime anymore. He hadn't been for years. He was cutting hair because the chair itself, not the building or the rental income sitting behind it, was still the actual machine generating everything else. What the granddaughter kept. Greco died in 1953, still working 3 days a week by his family's account, the building on Elizabeth Street still in his name, the cigar box ledger long since thrown out by someone who didn't understand what it had once recorded. His granddaughter kept one thing from the estate, not the deed, not any of the cash, but the chair itself, which sat in her own basement for years afterward, unused, the leather cracked and the chrome gone dull. She never explained, even to her own children, why she'd wanted it instead of anything else he'd left behind. Some things outlast their explanation.